Welcome back to Success with Steven. My name is Steven Smith. On this channel, we discuss all things financial literacy. The current administration launched strikes on Iran on February 28th, 2026. And I already know that the internet is going to be divided on this. Half the country is going to argue that it was necessary, and then the other half will argue that it was reckless. But that's not what I want to do in this video. I want to talk about the financial side of this, because whether you love it or you hate it, or you try your best to ignore politics completely, your money does not get to ignore geopolitics. When the US and Iran collide, it hits the markets very fast. It'll hit commodities, it'll hit confidence, and it'll also spill into your everyday life through prices, interest rates, and the value of your money. Now, I want to say this clearly because some people get uncomfortable when you talk about money during conflict. Human life matters more than dollars or any portfolio. But you can still hold that truth and still recognize something else at the same time. When the world gets unstable, the economic effects show up in your bank account. It shows up in your bills, your retirement accounts, and your ability to build wealth. So the goal of this video is to help you understand what Wall Street watches, why money moved the way that it's been moving, and what the chain reaction can look like from here. Because the moment this news hit, we saw money move immediately. We saw oil spike, we saw gold jump, we saw broad stock indexes slide when certain ones rallied. And that's not a coincidence. That is the market doing what it always does when uncertainty shows up. It reprices risk in real time, and if you understand the pattern, you stop being surprised by it, you stop panicking, you stop reacting emotionally, and you start making smarter decisions. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. Let's start with the what, because the why only makes sense after you see the reaction. When the conflict escalated, oil prices surged sharply in a single move. In that same window, global stocks slipped and investors piled into safer assets. Now that's the classic risk-off response. When people feel uncertainty, they sell some risk-on assets and they buy some for safety. You also saw a very specific split inside the stock market. Companies tied to defense and weapon systems, they tended to move up because markets assume that higher demand will happen during conflict. Meanwhile, the travel-related names and airlines got hit, because conflict in the Middle East has real implications for flight routes, cancellations, insurance costs, fuel costs, and demand. This is why I always tell people that Wall Street and banks, they don't move on emotion the way that social media does. The market is not sitting around debating morality. It's asking the colder questions like, where does the money go now? And that question matters because that is literally what sets prices. Markets move on expectations, not just on what already happened. If investors think oil supply is about to tighten, then oil goes up. If investors think consumer spending could slow down because of energy prices surging, then travel stocks can drop right now. If investors think oil supply is about to tighten, then oil goes up today. If investors think consumer spending could slow down because of energy prices surging, then travel stocks can drop today. If investors think inflation could get worse, bond yields and rate expectations can change today. The market is basically a prediction machine that'll update every second. Let's talk about gold, because people always ask, why does gold keep moving up? And gold is the asset that investors run to when things don't actually look good or they don't trust the situation. It's not perfect, but for decades, it has been treated as a store of value during uncertainty, especially when war risk rises and inflation fears also rise. So when conflict escalates and headlines get scary, you often see gold catch a quick bid because money is rotating out of risk and into perceived safety. Now, here's the part that matters for you. Gold moving up is not just people buying metal, it is a signal. It can be a signal that investors are worried about inflation, or they're worried about currency stability, or they're worried about broader spillover risk. And when those worries grow, the ripple effect can touch everything from interest rates to the housing market to how expensive it feels just to exist, which brings us to the bigger one, oil. If gold is the emotional thermometer of global fear, then oil is the bloodstream of the global economy. When oil spikes, people immediately think, yeah, great, gas is going up. And yes, that's part of it. But oil price also affects the cost of moving, literally everything from A to B. And if you really want to understand this, watch this show called Landman with Billy Bob Thornton. That'll definitely get you to understand how important that oil actually is. In other words, oil is embedded in the price of almost everything that you buy. So when oil moves fast, inflation risk moves with it. And in this situation, oil moved fast because of a specific choke point that investors will obsess over, the Strait of Hormuz. A significant share of global seaborne oil will flow through this narrow passage. Now, when shipping through this area gets disrupted or delayed, it becomes a very expensive thing to insure. Markets price in the possibility that supply to the rest of the world will start to tighten and prices will eventually go up. This is the reason why you can't treat an oil spike like it's some gas station issue. It's an everything issue. If it costs more to ship food, then food prices can rise. If it costs more for airlines to fuel planes, then tickets can rise. If it costs more to transport raw materials, then your business might face higher input costs, and they often pass those costs on to the consumer. So the oil move is the first domino. The inflation conversation is the second domino, and the interest rate conversation is the third domino effect. Let's make this practical. Imagine that you go to the grocery store and prices feel like they're creeping up again. A lot of people assume that's just corporate greed, or they assume it's just the government, or they assume that it's just the Fed. But what often happens is far simpler. The cost to produce and deliver goods has increased, so a business will always protect their margins. So when energy costs rise, trucking gets more expensive, warehouses will get more expensive, cold storage gets more expensive, deliveries more expensive, and of course, those costs don't just vanish, they land somewhere, and that's usually at the register. Now, zoom out. Vacation costs can rise because fuel is a major input for airlines, and if oil is up and stays up, then airlines either have to eat the cost, which rarely ever happens, or they have to raise their prices, they have to cut routes, or adjust capacity. At the same time, geopolitical conflict can create flight disruptions and cancellations in certain regions, which can add an additional layer of pressure on travel-related businesses. That's part of the reason why markets tend to hit travel stocks when conflict arises. So even if you personally never invested a single dollar into the stock market, you can still feel this kind of event through the cost of living. And now we have to talk about the piece that most people completely miss. Here's the reality. If inflation is already sticky and then oil prices start to spike, then we have to start worrying about the second wave of inflation pressure. And we have a good reason for this. The US market is sensitive right now. Recent US producers see price data has been running hotter than expected, which can signal upstream inflation pressure before it actually will reach consumers. Producer inflation matters because it's the business side of inflation. So if businesses pay more for inputs, many of them eventually charge more for the final products. So if the pipeline of cost is already elevated and then the world adds on oil shocks, the inflation narrative can get worse very quickly. And once inflation gets back into the conversation, then interest rates get back into the conversation, which brings us to the Federal Reserve. Let's talk about how the Fed fits into this, because this is the part that will directly touch your mortgage, your car payments, your credit card APR, and even your ability to refinance and access credit. The Federal Reserve's job is simple. It's to manage inflation and employment through monetary policy. Now, one of its biggest tools is interest rates. When inflation is too hot, the Fed tends to keep rates higher. When inflation cools, the economy weakens and the Fed can cut rates. But here's the problem. Oil spikes can push inflation expectations up, and when inflation expectations rise, it becomes harder for you to justify cutting rates aggressively. So even if the Fed wants to support the economy, and even if politicians want to lower rates, oil-driven inflation pressure can limit what the Fed feels comfortable doing. And that matters right now because there has been major attention on the upcoming leadership change when it comes to the Fed, including reports around the selection of Kevin Warsh to succeed Jerome Powell as the chair when Powell's chair term ends. The key point is not the personality, the key point is the environment. If inflation risk rises, then cutting rates become politically louder, but economically it's very hard to do. And that affects everything because mortgage rates don't live in a vacuum. They reflect inflation expectations, bond markets, Fed policy, and even border risk. So when you see oil prices rise because of a global choke point, then things start to get threatened. And that can echo all the way into your lender and what they offer you. And that is why these headlines are not just over there, they come right home. Now let's talk about something that sounds technical, but it's actually simple once you see it. The stock market is not just a scoreboard for how good companies are doing, it's supply and demand. If there are more buyers than sellers, then prices rise. If there are more sellers than buyers, then of course prices fall. And the United States stock market, especially the mega cap side of it, depends heavily on global capital flowing in. When international investors feel confident, they allocate to US assets, but when they feel uncertain, they diversify. And when they do that and they move their money into other places during a Middle East conflict involving the US and Iran, investors aren't just thinking about stocks. They're thinking about the currency risk, the energy risk, inflation risk, and geopolitical risk. Now, here is the retirement connection. If you have a 401k, most people's default allocation is heavily tied to US equities. So when global money decides to reduce risk, even temporarily, you can see a lot of volatility hit your retirement account. That doesn't mean that you should panic sell your 401k. In fact, doing that is how people permanently lock themselves into temporary fear. But it does mean that you should understand why your account can swing when geopolitics flare up. The market is reacting to flows, and the market is reacting to risk, and the market is reacting to the future. And your account is going along for the ride. So if you see things go up and down, it's not normal. That's something that you'll just have to deal with. The market is reacting to the flows, and it's reacting to the risk, and it's reacting to the future, and your account is just along for the ride. Now, let me say something that might save you money. Volatility is not automatically a problem. In fact, volatility is the price of admission to build wealth in markets. The problem is how people respond to volatility. People sell at the bottom because they can't take the stress, and people buy at the top because they finally feel safe. People change strategies every week because the headlines keep changing. And when geopolitics heat up, headlines become emotional, they're constantly loud, and that's exactly when investors make the most expensive mistakes. So your job is to not predict every move. Your job is to build a strategy that can survive any move, and that means understanding your time horizon, and that also means understanding your cash reserves, and that means understanding that your risk tolerance does have to be a little bit more. Not the fake one that you have when markets are green, but the real one when you have markets that are completely red. And it means understanding that certain events can create short-term shocks that may or may not have long-term shifts. Right now, a major question is duration. Markets are focused on whether this conflict will expand or how long disruptions will persist, because those two variables can change the inflation and the growth outlook. Now, that is the truth. Duration changes everything. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know exactly what tomorrow's going to look like, but I can tell you what matters next. The first thing is oil and shipping conditions, including whether disruptions will ease or they'll worsen. The second thing is inflation expectations, especially whether energy-driven prices increase or they start bleeding into broader inflation narratives. Recent producer price data has already been firm, and energy is the kind of accelerant that can make markets nervous. The third thing is interest rate expectations, because if oil stays elevated, it can pressure the outlook for rate cuts, and that affects housing, refinancing, business borrowing, and consumer credit. The fourth thing will be sector rotation. Watch the markets. They're going to reward some and they're going to punish others, because that's going to tell you how professionals are positioning for the next phase. And the fifth thing is your own plan, because you can't control any of the things that are happening right now, but you can control whether your strategy is built like a house of cards or built like a fortress. When the US escalates conflict with a major regional power like Iran, it's never just politics. It's oil, it's inflation, it's rates, it's consumer prices, and it's market volatility. It's retirement accounts, and it's the cost of living. You don't have to be a geopolitical expert, but you do need to understand the financial dominoes, because if you don't understand them, you'll keep getting blindsided by events that other people have trained themselves to anticipate. And the goal is not to profit off of tragedy. The goal is to protect your family, protect your future, and make smarter decisions even when the headlines are loud and they're scary. So if you got value from this video, then thank you. The best thing that you can do is refer this to someone, share this with a friend or family member or coworker or somebody who you know has money in the market and maybe they feel confused. And as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching this video, and you have a wonderful day.